Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be taking our discussion of entropy a little bit away from our microscopic scale, where we're looking at individual atoms and molecules, and more towards a more macroscopic scale. And we're going to do so by focusing in on entropy as a thermodynamic process. So again, in order to do this, we're going to essentially start working in a isolated super system, kind of like what we've done before, where we're going to mostly focus in on the entropy change of our system. However, the second law only gives us information about the entropy change of a total isolated super system. So we're going to do, in order to determine the entropy of the system, we're going to also have to build up a description of the entropy of the surroundings. And we're going to essentially look at a simple transfer of energy as heat from our surroundings to our system and figure out how this will change the entropy of our system, our surroundings, and our super system. So looking at our system, we know that the entropy of our system is going to increase when heated. But we need to try and build a good equational description of how this entropy changes. And we're going to do so by describing it based on the minimum amount of heat needed to drive a change or a process inside this system. So if I have some description of property or description of my system, I'm going to be looking at the minimum amount of heat needed to cause that rearrangement, not the actual amount of heat used. And this is going to give me some information about how the microstates inside my system change. And again, not too surprisingly, we're going to see that if I add more heat into the system, the entropy of the system is going to end up increasing because I have more microstates available. However, turns out we also need to define our entropy change based on the temperature of my system, because the higher the temperature, the less an impact a given amount of heat has. And we saw this a little bit when we looked at the micro scale. However, one of the useful things about defining the amount of heat being added to the system as a reversible or minimum amount of heat is this ends up constraining my system. So this heat value can only, so any given heat value has essentially the minimum amount of heat it requires, which turns it into a state function. And this means that I can go ahead and get the macroscopic change of my entropy simply based on my initial and final conditions, because we love state functions. It makes our integrals a whole lot easier to use. And again, one of the big advantages of using this minimum amount of heat is this use as a state function. And this means that my entropy is only going to depend on the initial and final states. So if I'm looking at the entropy change of any sort of closed process, where I say go from some initial state through some intermediate state back to an initial state, while I may have added a whole bunch of heat into my system, the minimum amount of heat, or the reversible heat, is going to be 0. And this is going to give us a lot of flexibility when describing the behavior of a system. Because again, I'm not going to be looking at how at the favorability of any given path, but simply based on looking at the favorability of how possible is it to go from some initial state to some new state. And this makes the use of a state function for entropy incredibly powerful. Now, with this essentially state function description and our definition of entropy as dependent on the minimum heat and temperature, well, what we can do is start building up a better description of our total entropy. By dividing it up into the change in entropy of my system plus the entropy of my surroundings, we can then go ahead and combine this with the second law of thermodynamics, which essentially says that in order for a process to spontaneously happen, so I don't have to put in energy, it has to be greater than 0. And this yields what's called the Clausius Inequality, where my total entropy can be defined as the sum of my system and surrounding entropy, and this has to be greater than 0. So this actually tells us a lot about chemical behavior, because it's going to actually be possible for a system to decrease in entropy. I can have a negative change in entropy, But in order to do so, I have to have a much greater increase in entropy of my surroundings. So this actually explains why it's possible for, say, plants to do photosynthesis. They can take a chaotic mess of molecules such as CO2 and water and turn them into glucose. But in order to do so, what's happened is they've increased the disorder of their surroundings. They've essentially put out a whole bunch of heat and a whole bunch of byproducts into the surrounding environment. So this actually tells us a lot about how life occurs. In order to make ourselves organized, we leave the world around us a bit of a mess. However, we're going to be focusing a little bit more on this energy transfer definition. So we can actually build up a description of the entropy of our system based on the minimum amount of heat it takes to cause a change and the temperature of the system. However, we also need to account for there being some degree of disorder in our surroundings. So this is going to be described based on the transfer of heat of our surroundings and the temperature of our surroundings. So this ends up giving us a net description of the total entropy of our grand super system based on the amount of heat being transferred. So again, the minimum amount of heat required to drive a process and the actual amount of heat provided by the surroundings. And again, with the temperature of our system and surroundings. And this whole function has to be greater than 0. However, let's be honest, we're not always the best at figuring out what's happening around us. So let's try and look at a limiting condition and look at the heat and try and find a better description for the heat and temperature of our surroundings. So a good place to start, as is frequently the case, is a reversible process. So a reversible process is going to, again, be the minimum amount of heat needed to drive the change in my system. Well, at that point, the actual amount of heat being provided by my surroundings is going to essentially be the negative of the heat being added to my system. Because again, any heat entering the system came from the surroundings in this reversible case. Similarly, just like with a pressure-driven compression, when we're looking at a temperature-driven heat transfer, in order for a process to be reversible, my systems and surroundings have to be at equilibrium. So the temperature of my system and the temperature of my surrounding are going to end up being equal. Now, what we can then do is say that my temperature of my system, by definition, my entropy of my system is going to be related to the entropy of the heat, the minimum amount of heat going into my system, and the temperature of that system. But we know that the heat going into my system is the negative of the heat going into my surroundings, and the temperature is essentially equivalent. So what we have is these two expressions are going to be identical. Well, this expression is just a reformation of the negative of the entropy of our surroundings. So what we can then do is go back to our Clausius expression. Again, the entropy of my surrounding, the entropy of my total supersystem is going to be equal to the change in entropy of my system and surroundings. Well, these two are equal but opposite, which means that when I add these two together, this is going to be 0. And it turns out that the total entropy change for any reversible process is going to always be 0. And this is actually an important description of what makes a system reversible. Because if I have a reversible system and my two temperatures are identical, well, this means that actually my heat can flow this direction or this direction. Because again, the actual value of this heat won't matter. It's going to essentially always yield me a total entropy change of 0. And one of the reasons why the value doesn't matter is because it's so infinitesimally small that we have just as much heat flowing from here to here as here to here. So this is an important definition of what makes a reversible system. And we already saw this a little bit with expansion and compression. As a reversible process is going to be one where the energy transfer is equally favorable in both directions. However, it turns out this is just another fancy way of saying that a reversible system is one where no change is going to occur at all, because there is equal transfer in both directions. However, again, as we brought up with compressions, this is usually why reversible is set as some sort of limiting condition. And in truth, to make a process occur at a timely scale and not take forever, we're going to have to deviate from reversibility by a little bit, but it does set a good set of limiting conditions. This is going to be essentially the minimum required for a given process. And so what we're going to do next time is take these ideas of reversible transfers of energy and try and actually make use of describing the spontaneity of a system by looking at a simple heat engine. So next time, it's the Carnot cycle. Until then, take care.